Hi guys, thanks for tuning into this screencast today. We're going to talk about some of the theories of MESH, which stands for Motivation, Emotion, Stress, and Health. So what is MESH? We kind of talked about this already as we looked at the Nearpod and the guided notes that introduced this unit, but just to review, motivation really has to do with the factors that activate, direct, and maintain behavior. We talked specifically about intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation, which we will talk about again in this presentation. Emotion really has to do with the subjective feeling that includes arousal, which is another word for excitement, cognitions, which is another word for thoughts, and expressive behaviors, which is another word for actions. Typically, we can divide emotion into two major categories. Our mood, which is meant to describe something that's relatively short term. For example, you might be in a bad mood if you receive a negative grade on a test, but sometimes you might be in a really good mood when you get a really good grade or score on an assessment. Temperament tends to be a little bit more long-term. If you think about the ideas of what makes an optimist versus a pessimist, looking at the glass as half empty or half full, so to speak, there are people that experience more happy emotions than negative emotions or sad emotions, and vice versa. We have to recognize that stress is also included in our understanding of MESH. Really, this has to do with both emotional and physical tension that we experience. We all experience motivation, emotion, and stress in a different way, but the theories we're going to talk about today are meant to generally understand each of these components of this unit. We have to recognize that they each link to our health as well. What I want you to keep in mind about health in this unit is we are talking about both the physical and psychological aspects of well-being. So as we go through these slides today, I'd like you to consider the following questions. What motivates you? What emotions do you experience on a regular basis? How often do you feel stressed? And how do each of these affect your health? So with that being said, we'll dive into our motivational theories. There are a lot of theories on motivation. We are only going to discuss and highlight really 4 of them, the 4 that are underlined. And luckily, 2 of them we've already discussed. For those of you that end up taking other psychology classes in the future, you will most likely talk about all of these and even more. So Maslow's hierarchy of needs was one of the first theories we discussed at the introduction to this unit. And really this theory suggests that in order for people to reach their self-actualization or our true potential, we need to have each of these other levels or needs met. Starting with the bottom, our physiological or physical needs, things like food, water, shelter, basic human essentials to life. We work our way up to what we call our safety needs. Personal security, employment, resources, health, and property may fall under this category. We then work our way to what we call love and belonging. Really, this has to do with the relationships we have with others in our lives, not necessarily just intimate relationships, but also friendships, relationships we have with family members and others. All of this leads to our understanding of esteem. Self-esteem really has to do with the way that we value ourselves. Recognizing that people with high self-esteem really can recognize their strengths and are willing to work on their weaknesses. People with high self-esteem are not considered cocky or arrogant, rather confident about who they are and who they wish to become. Each of these levels reaches this idea of self-actualization, really meaning our ability to be the best possible versions of ourselves or reaching our true potential. Another theory that we talked about a couple days ago were the types of motivators as intrinsic and extrinsic. Intrinsic really has to do with motivation that comes from within. So many of you might feel personally motivated by a certain subject area or a certain activity that you pursue outside of school. You don't necessarily need your family members or friends or maybe teachers or mentors to encourage you or motivate you to complete tasks related to that specialty or area that you like so much, your passion. This is something that you're personally motivated by. Whereas our extrinsic motivation usually has to do with things that are outside of us. Maybe these are people that motivate us. Maybe this has to do with other incentives, such as money, such as grades, such as trophies or awards. And this actually can apply to one of the newer theories that we can discuss today, which is called incentive theory. Really, our behavior is going to be dictated by a desire for external rewards. Again, those things like money, grades, maybe some type of recognition, some type of award. All of those are really what's going to drive behavior. So when we talk about intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, we have to recognize that we each possess both types of motivators. Neither is right or wrong. Or really, both are necessary in order to direct our behavior in a certain way. The last motivation theory that we can talk about is what we call arousal theory, which is really based on this idea that in order for us to achieve our best level of performance, we need to have an optimal level of arousal or excitement. That optimum level of arousal is usually like a middle or moderate or a medium level of excitement. So for example, if we go into a test with a lot of anxiety, most likely we're not going to perform well on that test. On the flip side, if we go into that test feeling really down in the dumps, chances are we're not going to perform well either. We need to find kind of a happy medium, kind of like a Goldilocks effect. And this can be applied to other things outside of the school realm. For those of you that perform, whether it be in school plays, musicals, for those of you that participate in sporting events, any time where you are performing or you're expected to perform, this can be applied. We're really trying to find a medium or moderate level of excitement in order to be or to perform at our very best. So we can also talk a little bit about emotion theories. Again, the first theory we talked about already. Ekman's 7 universal emotions are really meant to describe 7 emotions that cross-culturally are expressed in the exact same way. What's really interesting about Ekman's theory of the 7 universal emotions is that they even tested this theory in individuals who were born blind, and even in individuals that were born without sight, meaning that they never had the opportunity to observe other people's emotions, they still expressed these 7 emotions in the exact same ways, recognizing that these 7 universal emotions might be somewhat biological. For those of you that have ever seen the movie Inside Out, this theory is actually referenced. 5 of these particular universal emotions are the emotions represented in that Pixar movie. We'll talk about some of these other ones momentarily as well. The facial feedback hypothesis or theory really has to do with the idea that if we change our facial expressions or our body expressions, this might change our overall mood. Okay, so in this particular graphic, you can see that many of the time when we smile, we might find pictures that are funny, even funnier. If you've ever been in an event where you didn't necessarily want to be there and somebody told you to kind of fake it until you make it, smile, until you start to feel happy, chances are just by creating that facial expression and that body language and posture, you probably did start to feel better about being there. This can also work in the negative effect. We see this a lot of the times, when we watch some type of sad or scary movie. We start to feel the way that we see other people feel. And mainly that's because we're mimicking the expressions that we see the actors or actresses portray on the screen. This is another depiction of the 7 universal emotions, just so that you can see the facial expressions we're talking about. We have joy or happiness, surprise, contempt, sadness, anger, disgust, and fear. The last emotional theory that I wanted to discuss with you guys today is something called the Schachter-Singer theory of emotion, otherwise known as the 2-factor theory of emotion. Really, when we are experiencing some type of feeling, there's a physical arousal or a physiological arousal, as well as a cognitive label. For example, when we're scared, our heart rate usually increases. We start to sweat. And usually because we have those physiological sensations, we start to think to ourselves, oh my gosh, I must be scared. I'm starting to panic. That's that cognitive label piece. In order for us to really identify that emotion as fear or being afraid, we need both components, the physical component as well as the thought process. We also have some theories to understand stress. So Seeley's GAS, or General Adaptation System, is broken down into 3 major stages that we'll talk about momentarily. We also have Lazarus's cognitive appraisal theory, which really talks about how we evaluate stress within our life. We have to remember that stress really has to do with both an emotional state and a physical state. And I think that the general adaptation stages really breaks this down nicely. So our alarm stage is kind of like our first initial state of panic. A lot of the time when something stressful comes up, we start to kind of recognize that stress and we start to kind of prepare ourselves to what we call fight or flight. That would fall under the resistance stage. For those of you that are interested in biology, neuroscience, anatomy, and physiology, when you think about the activation of the sympathetic nervous system, that fight or flight response, am I going to fight off the stress or I'm going to like hide in a hole and run away? That's really what we're talking about with the resistance stage. We then have our exhaustion stage. Many times after we experience a bout of stress, we're tired, we're fatigued, and this also leaves us victim to potentially contracting some type of illness or sickness. So a lot of the time when we're exhausted after fighting off the stress for so long, we fall ill. I think one of the best examples of this might be for those of you that are in school-wide performances, musicals, etc. A lot of the times you have a weekend where you perform multiple times and you're like running on autopilot, really trying to just do your very best at every single moment. And then once that last performance is over, a lot of the times you're so tired, you fall more victim to becoming sick because your body can't fight off the stress anymore. The other theory of stress that we're going to talk about today is the cognitive appraisal theory. Appraisal is really just a fancy word for evaluation. So how we evaluate stress. The first or primary appraisal or the first evaluation of stress is going to be whether or not we deem a stressor stressful. A stressor is some type of event that causes some level of emotional or physical discomfort within ourselves. Sometimes when events take place, they might not necessarily seem stressful. So our first appraisal or our primary appraisal is really going to be evaluating whether or not that event is stressful. Our secondary appraisal really has to do with how we're going to handle or combat the stress. So with some stressors, we tend to handle maybe better than others. Maybe failing a test, we tend to cope with a lot better than losing a loved one. We have different types of stress. We have different extremes of stress. And we'll talk a little bit more in this presentation and later in this unit on how we can cope. So the last part of MESH is that health component, and we said that health really has to do with both our physical and psychological well-being. We have our short-term issues, which might look like something like muscle tension, headaches, stomach aches when we feel stressed or are experiencing negative emotions. We also have maybe some long-term issues. Studies have shown that stress and negative emotions have been linked to things like heart disease, things like obesity, high blood pressure, diabetes, etc. We have to recognize that stress and negative emotions also may have an impact on our relationships with others, maybe have an impact on how we perform at work or at school, maybe our sleep and eating schedules, and also how we make decisions. So we really should be creating and finding healthy ways to combat the stress, which is really what we're going to focus on in the last part of this unit. So some coping strategies for yourself that you should be mindful of. Problem-focused coping really has to do with maybe attacking the stressor at its source. Maybe you decide to seek counsel or help when you need it. Maybe you plan or time manage as best as you can to make sure you can complete all your necessary tasks. Whereas emotion-focused coping really has to do with attacking the negative emotion that comes from the stress. Maybe that's mindfulness or meditation. All of this falls under this category of positive psychology or achieving happiness. And really, positive psychologists believe that we all have the capability to be happy. So we will continue to work on some of these things as the unit progresses. I really appreciate you listening in today. We will continue to talk about mesh as this unit progresses. Thank you and have a nice day.